all get started. I'm Frank Gavin. I am the director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs here at SAIS, and I could not be more pleased to welcome Dr. Rana Mitter here to SAIS. Dr. Mitter is an extraordinary historian of China. A terrific book, A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World, and his most recent book, China's War with Japan, which I really highly commend, 1937 and 1945. The thing about Rana is he's not just an extraordinary historian. He writes beautifully, and he's able to connect the past to contemporary issues in a way that few people have the depth skill to do. He's someone who in Great Britain is the go-to person for serious public commentary on all issues involving politics of East Asia, and particularly China. Dr. Mitter has had a long visit with us to Johns Hopkins. He spent yesterday visiting with our colleagues in the history department and graciously agreed to join us today before I think running back to London to receive a knighthood. Is that what you told me? or to one of the secret societies that he's involved in. But we could not be happier to have him with us today. He's the title of his talk is The Cairo Syndrome, China's International Relations and the Politics of Wartime Memory. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitter.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. Many thanks to Professor Gavin for, I think, his extremely, perhaps overly generous introduction, but I value it partly because I still have traumatic memories. Some 20 years ago, giving my first public talks at a university in London, in fact, where I think 4 people showed up, and at the end of the session, the chair turned to me after I'd spoken and said, "You know, your project is wrong. All of it. It's completely wrong." So from that point, we could only move upwards. It's very kind also all of you to join us here, and I hope it's not just the free sandwiches and sodas that have brought you here today, but the chance I hope for a little conversation about a topic that I think is of real significance in terms of understanding some of the dynamics behind the development of contemporary Chinese nationalism, a term which is very frequently used, not least in news coverage, but often I think is not analysed enough in terms of what actually constitutes it and makes it, I think, often a very nuanced and complex phenomenon. And the way in which I want to do that is by giving you a section of what actually is a book manuscript that I'm currently finishing up, and with a sort of gun pointed at my head, I have to get the final version in by the beginning of next month, so I have this last chance to collect comments, corrections, and other thoughts from a variety of, I hope, broadly sympathetic audiences and bring them into the final version of the work. And I'll say more about the specific topic of today in just a moment. But overall, the book is arguing that one important element that I think in the Western world is relatively little understood and appreciated in terms of looking at that contemporary Chinese nationalism is the legacy and collective and social memory of China's experience of World War II. The Second World War period, the Sino-Japanese War, the War of Resistance against Japan, Kankan, is one of those events that is immensely formative and important in terms of modern Chinese history, but tends to be either ignored or dismissed in the wider global literature. And other parts of the book deal more with domestic politics, regional politics, change in terms of areas such as social media, popular culture, and so forth. But for today's session, I wanted to pay tribute to SAIS by speaking about China's role in international society and how that particular phenomenon relates to understanding China's wider role, particularly as it relates to the now very controversial subject of revision of the international rules-based order. But I thought that the way that I would come into this, indulging my own preferences, was to start not with geopolitics, but with the movies, or with TV, which I always like to be able to put on the screen and then claim I'm actually doing research. And to do this, I'll start with, I think many of you here are probably far too young, but at least some of you may remember from a decade or so ago that on American screens and then worldwide, the Hollywood power production team of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks presented The Pacific, which was a sort of follow-up to Band of Brothers, their huge hit about American soldiers in the European theatre of World War II, and this clearly is about the Asian Pacific theatre of the Second World War. How many people here actually may have seen an episode or two or more of that Pacific? A few people seen it? So many. Okay, and I'm guessing that we have also some students and visitors from China here in the audience? Yes, okay. So, in the same year was also released this movie, Du Fengyu. Has anyone here seen Du Fengyu? No, not at all. Oh dear, I'm not appealing to the youth market in that case. It's only for oldies like me. Well, at the same time, the same year, Du Fengyu, which actually is kind of a good movie, East Wind Rain, was released in China's cinemas, starring at that point a young and not very well-known actress called Fan Bingbing, who I guess you probably have. Ah, yes, absolutely. I think this lady's a tax accountant, that's probably why she's laughing so hard. And as we know, Fan Bingbing would go on to become not only China's most famous movie star, but most famous tax exile as well. This film's plot hangs actually on an intelligence discovery by Chinese Communist Party agents about the upcoming attack on Pearl Harbor. It's set in 1941. And this plot is about, although the information from the Chinese communists is transmitted onto Washington, D.C., to the FDR, the Roosevelt administration, the Americans simply ignore it, and therefore Pearl Harbor happens. This was, of course, a historiographical discovery of huge importance, with the one minor drawback that it was entirely the invention of the scriptwriter's mind and never actually happened in real life. But that doesn't stop it from underpinning this particular movie. So these two productions, the Tom Hanks HBO Pacific TV box set and the East Wind Rain movie, directed by Liu Yinluo, were the subject of a blog written by, in at least one case, a rather well-known leftist commentator, Sima Pingban, who has written quite a lot of cultural issues on the Chinese net, along with collaborator Ming Guoshao, these are pseudonyms, of course. And their piece was called "Why Are China and the US Both Rewriting the History of the Pacific War?" And in a quite lengthy analysis of both of these fictional products, the bloggers detect a wider discourse in both countries, claiming a political legacy from those wartime years. And they write on the blog, again my translation here, if you peel below the surface of some of the stories of justice and heroism, then there is this hidden tendency towards conspiracy and competition in their own interests, talking about the China and US sides both. On the Chinese side, they wrote, although they don't think that this movie, East Wind Rain, they don't think it's an overtly nationalistic production like some of the books that appeared in the the late 90s and 2000s in China, the famous 中国可以说不, China can say no, and 中国还可以说不, China can still say no. And then the sequel to the sequel, which was 中国不高兴, which is literally China's not happy, but is actually probably, if you'd excuse me, more correct translated as China's pissed, which is a series of these very confrontational, very kind of strongly, almost xenophobic productions. That was not the mode in which these Chinese critics took this particular film. But they did see it as subtly trying to give China an upper rhetorical hand by suggesting that Pearl Harbor was an American failure that could have been solved by heeding Chinese advice, even though, of course, this advice was entirely fictional. And by implication, this was a rejection of the view that China was nothing more than a victim during the Second World War, just waiting to be saved by the Americans. A point of view which is still quite mainstream in that relatively small part of the historiography of World War II today, which actually deals with the China theatre of war at all. And writing about the HBO show, as opposed to the Chinese film, these two bloggers argued that, quote, the series says, because the Americans saved people from the claws of the demon Japanese, that's why the US now gets to have the strongest army in the world. And they conclude, the release of these two films is not just about plots or performances. Just as the US lets the world know that at a most dangerous time for humanity, World War II, it bore burdens and made sacrifices, so China has finally dared to propagate in the same way that during the war it also bore burdens and sacrifices. And this represents another continuity of the competition over politics economics and culture of these two countries. I bring up this particular example because it serves as a vignette to illustrate that I think that changing collective memory of that wartime experience, the war, the World War II experience, has significantly shaped many aspects of Chinese political culture, and that includes its international relations, more in the 21st century than actually in the late 20th. And I will talk about the US-China relationship, but actually I think that in some ways this very troubled encounter that we've talked about is, or I've talked about, is an immensely important strand of a much wider sense of the way in which China thinks about its relationship with its own region as well. Before I explain what I mean about that, let me just, if I may, give 2 or 3 bullet points about China's experience in World War II, since while I'm sure this room is immensely expert on the subject, I have discovered that the precise details of China's involvement in the conflict are not always immediately to hand with all audiences. One of the reasons actually why the American title of the book on World War II in China that I wrote, that Frank very kindly mentioned, is actually called Forgotten Ally, for precisely that reason. The title actually, which was used again by the Chinese when they translated it for the mainland Chinese market, taking on board the excuse me, the idea that they too felt that they had been rather forgotten from this historiography. So World War II in China, depending on how you look at it, lasted at least 8 years, from the outbreak of war in 1937 to its ending in 1945. The outbreak of war in that scenario being, of course, not the invasion of Poland by the Germans in 1939, but rather the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident, where Chinese and Japanese troops clashed on the 7th of July 1937, just outside Beijing, and within a few weeks the war had escalated into an all-out confrontation between China and Japan. The details of the war and the campaigns and the huge social turmoil, which I think is one of the most major effects of that particular war, are not something I'll elaborate here. As I say, I've written about it before, but it is worth understanding the scale. Something like 10 to 14 million Chinese, both civilian and military, were killed during the course of the war. Many more were mutilated or wounded. 80 to 100 million Chinese during that period, according to our best recent research, became refugees in their own country during that time, something like 1 in 6 of the entire population. The slow, flawed, but real modernization in terms of industry, railways, roads, educational provision and so forth, which were building up under the nationalist Kuomintang regime of the then Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, were essentially smashed into pieces. Most of China's modernization was destroyed under Japanese bombing during those years of war. And last but by no means least, it is worth remembering that the China quagmire, essentially, which emerged, held down over 500,000 Japanese troops in the first years of the war, before Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the British Empire and, I believe you guys were there as well, the United States in World War II in Asia, thereby providing a very important factor that essentially kept at least one anti-Japanese force, the Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists, in the war, at a time when many people thought that, frankly, it was more logical for the Chinese to make a deal and surrender to the Japanese. Another interesting controversy, which we can't go into here, but worth thinking about at least for a moment, as a counterfactual in terms not just of the progress of Asia's World War II, but actually the effect that might have had on the global conflict as a whole. And I think that today, there are at least 3 elements of China's international relations that are underpinned in some narrative sense by that collective memory of the wartime period. One is the relationship with Japan, most obviously. One is the relationship with the United States, and the other actually with neighbors such as South Korea, which also experienced Japanese invasion and occupation. The Japanese relationship being shaped with a sort of scratchiness, to put it in its most gentle, in terms of belief, both genuine and partly constructive political reasons, that Japan has not done enough to apologize as a society for its war crimes in China. The American connection is based more on a recently reconstructed resentment that the United States' presence in the region, in terms of military security and alliance presences, draws on a point of origin in the wartime, more than 7 decades after the end of the war, and therefore rewriting the originary myths of where the 1945 settlement actually came from, and that's something I'll talk about a little bit more in just a few minutes, is being done both to give China greater prominence and to reduce the hegemonic role of the United States in that particular narrative. And on the third point, with Asian neighbours who suffered in the 30s and 40s under Japanese rule, China's aim is to create a sense of narrative solidarity that might facilitate new connections and even alliances. But I would say that so far over the last 5, 10, 15 years, I do feel that this attempt has regularly fallen victim to inconsistent diplomacy. So for instance, China's solidarity with South Korea on issues such as compensation for forced female sex workers, known slightly incorrectly as comfort women, fades quite quickly when South Korea acts positively towards the US on issues such as the deployment of the THAAD anti-missile system just a couple of years ago. And that inconsistency, I think, has made it more difficult for China to obtain traction in terms of this historically informed narrative. But running through the whole idea and the whole discourse that China's putting forward about its World War II experience, I think is one quite central factor, and I think it's one that's acknowledged but not really, I think, thought through in as solid a form as it might be. And that is the growing enthusiasm internationally, not just in China, for justice as a concept in international relations. The sense that China has in some senses been cheated, been shortchanged by international order, and that it deserves to have its status and claims treated with greater seriousness is a growing factor. And that quest relates largely to China's own position as part of the international order, but there is also an impetus to create a moral standing for China that would enable it to persuade other actors to support its aims. And in that respect, China's attempts to draw on its own reconstructed war memory reflect unease at its own international relations strategy that still seems almost entirely realist in terms of being driven by ideas of power. The attempt to create an underlying moral freight for the Chinese presence in the region is a major piece of what historians call memory work in progress. And I would add just at the end of that thought that I would say that this is slightly different from what you sometimes hear, which is the idea that China is seeking to be a revisionist power with regard to the post-1945 order in Asia. I think it is looking to revise certain understandings, but part of the point of what I want to say and try and give some evidence for in the next section of what I want to talk about is actually not Chinese revisionism in terms of wanting to kind of tear up the whole system and start again, which might have been perhaps a more accurate view of the Mao period and that really very revolutionary approach to international diplomacy. In this case, it's much more, I think, about China actually seeking to insert its own shared ownership of the existing system and to adapt Dean Acheson's famous phrase, point out that when the US was present at the creation, China was too and deserves to benefit from the fruits of that early presence in the foundation of that current order, particularly at a time when it seems to many to be under threat. Now, I should say that although this is a phenomenon that I think that has been growing in significance and reach in the last few decades, last few years, it is by no means new in terms of having only emerged in the last 3 or 4 years, for instance. I think the idea of China as creator of a new understanding of the origins of order in 1945 was visible as early as the 1980s, a period when, after the Cultural Revolution, China was seeking to reconstitute its own sense of national and international identity and also draw on much more fact-based, research-based understanding of its own position. And in that context, I will show you a picture of Xi. This is actually Hu Qiaomu, a very senior Chinese communist politician of the 20th century, Mao's personal secretary. He spent a great deal of time in Yan'an, the famous Red Base area, which operated under Mao's rule during the World War II period. This is a very rare photograph of, I should add as well, Hu Qiaomu was also a historian, and actually rather a well-trained one, and wrote several, at the time, celebrated and influential books on Chinese Communist Party history from the 1950s onwards. So he was someone who actually had historical training and could call himself a historian in the proper sense, as well as being a very high-level party official. The two roles were by no means incompatible in his mind. I should say this is also quite a rare photograph of Hu Jiamu as a younger man smiling, since he was not a man known for his tremendous sense of humour. I was once shown around his personal book collection after he died in the early 90s, and I was taken to his personal library, which is now stored at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, and he had an awful lot of books on Marxist-Leninist theory, as you would expect. And I asked my guide, 他没有小说吗? Didn't he have any novels? To which the guy replied, 不是，他是一个很认真的人物. He was an extremely conscientious personality. So this was someone who clearly didn't fool around in all sorts of ways. He was someone who took history and its meaning very, very seriously. And in 1987, Hu Jiamu wrote an editorial in the People's Daily about what he called, quotes, the immense significance of the war of resistance against the Japanese. And he did this in large part to try and argue that in terms of China's then still fast developing international status in the 1980s, that the war of resistance against Japan needed to be kept much more in mind as a point of origin. So he said, no matter what, the war of resistance has great significance for China's revolutionary history. Then added, but another great significance of the war of resistance is that it fundamentally changed the international politics of the Far East. By the way, the term Far East is not exactly politically correct, but since it was Hu Jiamu using it, he used the phrase Yuandong. I guess in this case I'm entitled to use it too. And he said before the conclusion of the 8 years of the War of Resistance, Japanese imperialism was on the rampage in Asia. After the war was ended in 1945, Paul noted the defeated Japanese adopted their peace constitution. Chinese judges got to sit in judgment on the Japanese war criminals at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. And then Hu Jiamu reached the end point of this teleology he was writing about in this editorial in 1987. So he said, just a year later, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, declared its foundation. The old China, that was called the sick man of East Asia, would not return. At the same time, the old structure of the Far East and the old structure of the world would not return. Now, this seems to be quite a prescient thing to be saying in 1987. It looks like a sort of incipient version of a new vision of international order waiting to come into being, which we now, with more than 30 years retrospect, are able to see. After all, in 1987, there were many assumptions that people would have made, certainly I think including Hu Jiamu and most of us who were old enough to be alive at that time. For instance, the durability of the Soviet Union being the obvious example. Nobody at that point was thinking about a world order in which the USSR in that form would not exist. One other assumption that, from all my accounts of what's happening in Washington these days, is certainly relevant now, and certainly would have been relevant, say, 20 years before Hu Jiamu's editorial, was not so important in 1987. And that is the assumption that the US and China would necessarily be hostile to one another. It's worth remembering that 1987 was probably one of the last years during that weird sort of interstitial period when China was not exactly an ally of the United States, but compared to the Soviet Union, it was on better terms. And of course, with diplomatic relations having opened up under Jimmy Carter in '79, and 2 years before, Tiananmen Square brought that much more liberal phase of Chinese political development to a very abrupt end. This was again an interesting moment for someone like Hu Jiamu to be making these predictions about the future of global order. But Hu's statement that a large part of the war's significance was to do with international order was important in terms of framing the Second World War, the Sino-Japanese War, as a point of origin for the contemporary international system. And in doing so, he does a couple of things which are implicit there in 1987, but which become much, much more explicit and important in reshaping the narrative in the following decades. By which I mean that mention I made very briefly in the quote from him, and I'll say again, about Chinese judges judging Japanese war criminals at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in 1948. And the reason that's significant is that, of course, the Chinese judges, particularly Judge Mei Hua, who was actually at Tokyo at that time, was, of course, not a communist judge, he was, of course, an official of the Kuomintang nationalist government, a figure who, until very shortly before that 1987 editorial, would have been regarded essentially as a renegade, as a political criminal in his own right, and certainly not someone whose contribution was seen as part of reordering China's status in the wider world. So the implication at that time that there was going to be a revision of the importance of the Kuomintang nationalist government and Chiang Kai-shek's government as part of this longer trajectory of China's history and entry into sovereign status and international order was being put forward by probably one of the most hardcore communist ideologists that one could think of during that particular period. And during the following quarter century after that 1987 People's Daily editorial, official and popular interest in the Second World War continued, and I would say has continued, I think it's a continuing process right now, to rise in China. And that rehabilitation of the nationalist war record at home also meant there was more of a chance to bring involvement into the Chinese view of international relations abroad. And while again I won't go into huge detail here, amongst the reasons, which I discuss elsewhere in this book that I've mentioned, for the slow but steady rehabilitation, at least of the Chinese nationalist war effort, was to do with warming up relations with Taiwan. That's one very, very clear area where they were trying to clearly mend relations, as well as with a new willingness to try and essentially pressure Japan more in international society about its record of war crimes in China, which actually the mainland had gone quite soft on during the Cold War years when they were trying to detach Tokyo from the Cold War embrace of the United States. Clearly after 1972, that dynamic changed rather significantly. So as that blogger I mentioned at the beginning, Sima Pingbang, observed, the American presence in Asia draws its justification historically from sacrifices made by US troops to recover the region from Japan during World War II, and therefore China has over time been developing a very similar justification as part of a strategy of different discourses to give itself greater influence in the region. And one article by, not by Hu Jiamu, but by a major historian, but a very well-connected one, Huang Meizhen, also from the same year, argued that China's war against the Japanese, the Chinese phase of World War II, quote, delayed the outbreak of the Pacific War so that the Western democracies could strengthen their strategies and gain precious time, and that furthermore that China's war effort, quote, strongly supported the war of the British and the Americans in the Pacific. So back in 1987, there was very little chance of leveraging that viewpoint into an explicit statement of China's contemporary geostrategy, not least because in 1987, well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but China didn't have much of a geostrategy. The intervening decades have changed the situation very significantly. In those years, China's overall aim has been to create a particular set of ideas that seek to rewrite the narrative of World War II in Asia as part of its international self-projection. First, saying that China has made a contribution to that war that was never acknowledged by the West. Second, therefore I think is one of the interesting conjunctions that demands a lot of weight to be placed on it. Therefore, China deserves a greater say in the arrangement of the Asia-Pacific security architecture. And third, and this one comes and goes, Japan is an increasing menace that justifies great awareness by China and should not be allowed any wider role in the region's international politics than it has already. And that implication that you see in the early 1980s had by the early 21st century, by our own period, become a much further claim. I think that during the 2000s, we see a whole variety of changes, and I'll just cover them briefly before we come to some of the specifics of the way in which I think that the war is being referenced by the Chinese, to give ourselves a bit of context. First of all, delegitimizing the US presence in East Asia has become a priority for China after, let's say, the 1990s, in a way that was not true in the same way in the 1980s. So that, I think, is a shift during that period. Second, the late 2000s, the sort of first years of the new millennium, saw a variety of important changes in the nature of Asian regional order. Many of the people studying and teaching in this building, I think, have had quite a bit to do with that. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 did herald, at least for a while, a more internationalist approach than some perceived the previous George W. Bush administration as having had. At the same time, and this sometimes gets forgotten, Japan had a period 2009 to 12 of a DPJ as opposed to LDP government, in which, at least rhetorically, there was a certain edging away by the prime ministers of Japan from an all-out embrace of the existing relationship with the US, in a hope that they might be more accommodating to an approach from China to actually reorient the region. And I think of the many missed opportunities for China during that period, the inability to pick up on that offer from the DPJ is something that I suspect that many policymakers in Beijing are rather kicking themselves for in retrospect. One of the reasons they didn't, again it's worth remembering, is that same period, 2011 to 2013, marks what we now know as the immense political turbulence caused by the attempts by Bo Xilai to seize power and then his deposition, the trial of him and his wife for corruption, murder and so forth, all of which it's now clear created a huge turbulence within the leadership that, while it did not derail the rise to power of Xi Jinping, which was clearly on the way anyway, nonetheless fueled further a sense of besiegement and unwillingness to allow any kind of flexibility in terms of a whole variety of domestic and international politics. And that meant that during that period, you repeatedly saw, this is the beginning of this decade that we're in now, so the beginning of the 2010s, a rather harsh tone from China towards its neighbours. Japan, disputes over the Jiangyu Senkaku Islands were beginning to come to a height during that same period, 2012, 2013. ASEAN countries involved in dispute over the South China Sea. And China, I think at that point, was indulging in some pretty inept diplomacy, which was in some ways, I think, a product of trying to reorient itself at a time when it felt off balance, trying to work out what the Obama administration was going to do in the region. And as a result, China spent time thinking about its revisionist argument on a whole variety of areas. One area, of course, was the idea of China as a benevolent developer of the economics of the region. And that, of course, was the point of origin of what's become known as the Belt and Road Initiative, which was formally announced in 2013. So again, at the end of this sort of sub-period that we're talking about, but one which has clearly been discussed for some time before it actually became an officially adopted policy. But also the wider argument that revisionist history, and particularly China's role in defeat of Japan and its formation of contemporary international order, should become a much more central element of the way that China projected itself. And this could be seen, for instance, in the address to a study group at the Academy of Military Sciences in Beijing by Xi Jinping himself on the 30th of July 2015, a period, of course, of great significance in terms of anniversaries, because this was leading up to the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II in Asia, 1945 to 2015. Xi Jinping observed in this speech, which was later published, that, quote, "The goal is to reconsider the great part of the Chinese people's war of resistance and confirm the great contribution that the war of resistance made to the victory in the world anti-fascist war, and to show our, meaning China's, upholding of the results from the victory in the Second World War and determination for international peace and justice." And by the way, that phrasing Second World War in Chinese, Zhan, rather than War of Resistance to Japan, is important because it switches the way in which Xi is describing it between a rather inward-directed term that would be more recognized in China and a term which is more recognized globally as being part of a global context. But Xi went on to warn in the speech that, quote, "In comparison with the historical position and significance of China's war of resistance, in comparison with the influence of this war on our Chinese nation, Zhonghua Minzu, and the world, research on the war is not nearly sufficient. We must encourage international society accurately to recognize the position and role in the world anti-fascist war of the Chinese people's war of resistance." So very explicitly from Xi's speechwriters, but put into his mouth and said in a very prominent venue, the argument that a revisionist view of history must be part of China's strategy in terms of justifying its presence in the region and giving itself moral freight to actually undertake revisions in that order which it seeks to put forward. Now, this isn't a single linear process. As the international relations theorist William Callahan has shown, a whole range of historical examples, many relating more broadly to Chinese ideas of national humiliation, have been used to create the idea of China as a state that has been historically under siege in the modern era, and which has every right, therefore, to be defensive about its status. Other historical metaphors are more outward-looking. One of the most famous, of course, recently is Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty admiral who sailed many times in the 15th century to Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere as part of a journey of discovery and trade. So China is eager to claim that its standing in Asia derives in part from its participation in the war that still gives rise to the order dominant in the region. And to show that, let's now look at some of the specific ways in which ideas, narratives, tropes relating to that Second World War and China's role in it have been used in recent engagements by China with international order. So one I witnessed myself in my pajamas, I should say, and I hasten to add that this is not going to go anywhere problematic, I hasten to add. But I say that because I was watching the late night news in Britain on the 8th of January 2014 in bed, and on that show that night, one of Britain's best-known news hosts, a man called Jeremy Paxman, was talking to the Japanese and Chinese ambassadors in London about the disputed sovereignty over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, the 8 uninhabited islands that sit halfway between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And at one point, Ambassador Liu Xiaoming of the People's Republic declared that the origins of this disagreement lay in the Cairo Conference during World War II. And Jeremy Paxman, for those who know Britain, will know that he's one of the most hardcore, hard-bitten journalists, but he found himself just for once lost for words, saying he'd never actually heard about the Cairo Conference and had no idea what it was. He was not alone in his puzzlement, because most of the Western world, even World War II buffs, have frankly paid little attention to the 70th anniversary of the Cairo Conference, which fell in November 2013. But in China, and indeed in Taiwan, the anniversary was noted with some interest. So, the Cairo Conference was the only conference of World War II where China was treated as an equal allied power with the United States and Britain, not the Soviet Union, which of course was not present in the war in Asia formally until the very last weeks of August 1945. Last weeks of the war in August 1945. But you have here, sorry, the graininess of this picture is a little, it's not as well defined as it might be. But I think you can see here in the Egyptian sunshine of late November 1943, Churchill in his white safari suit, President Roosevelt. On the left-hand side, Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader, and on the right, by no means insignificantly, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Soumeiling, who of course, as a fluent English speaker trained at Wellesley College, was essentially China's face to the wider world at that particular point. And while in terms of the strategy of World War II, Cairo was perhaps not the most significant conference of the war, not least because a separate conference was held shortly afterwards at Tehran without Chiang, but with Stalin, where they reversed most of the decisions that had been made at Cairo. But in symbolic terms, in which, and again, in the Q&A, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think is the first occasion at which a non-Western, let's say it, non-white, national leader of a non-European state sat in equal status with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the British Empire. This was a very significant moment. And certainly for anti-colonialists around the world, many of the Indian independence leaders who were in jail by this stage, a lot of people in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, people actually looking from the Axis-occupied Japanese empire, which occupied much of Asia, this moment became symbolically a very important one, perhaps was in some senses the high point of Chiang Kai-shek's diplomatic presence in the wider world. Now, this particular conference and this particular moment in which China's status, I should say also 1943 is significant because it was the year that the so-called unequal treaties, which had been signed after the Opium Wars, starting in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing, were finally abrogated by the British, slightly reluctantly but under US pressure, meaning that, at least for the first time, even though it was stripped by war, China was finally fully sovereign again. So if anyone from the PRC tells you that it was Mao Zedong who brought back Chinese sovereignty, not true, it was Chiang Kai-shek. In that context, this particular moment actually was remarkably absent from most educational materials, textbooks, and historical programs in mainland China, in the People's Republic, until really quite late in the day, because of the inconvenient reality that it was the nationalist leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, and not Mao Zedong, who actually had that status during the wartime years. But the new willingness to tolerate partial rehabilitation of the Chiang Kai-shek's regime's wartime record within China itself in the mainland in the 1990s and 2000s meant that it became possible to use the Cairo conference to illustrate a wider point. The point that China was indeed on the side of the Allies and fighting very hard at the most crucial moment for civilization of the past century. So just as the French historian Henri Rousseau referred to the multiple ways in which aspects of the wartime occupation regime in France affected post-war French life as what he called the Vichy syndrome, I think in some ways China's foreign policy makers developed something what I call a Cairo syndrome, using this particular historical event to actually make a whole variety of points about what China deserves and should have in the present day. The particular issue that piqued the interest of China's foreign policy makers in 2013, 70 years on, was the meaning that they drew from the declaration made at the end of the conference, I think in fact dated 1st of December, in which it stated, speaking for the Allies as a whole, that, quote, "It is their purpose," meaning the Allies' purpose, "it is their purpose that Japan shall be stripped of all the islands in the Pacific which she has seized or occupied since the beginning of the First World War in 1914, and that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China." And the declaration also added that Japan should be expelled from all other territories which is taken by violence and by greed. Now, the estrangement of the US and China during the Cold War meant that actually, in practice, the Chinese had almost no role in the dismantling of the Japanese empire in Asia. Had Chiang Kai-shek stayed in power, which again is one of those counterfactuals we can't really spend too much time going into, it is clear that China's nationalist government considered itself to be a major player in terms of the way in which Asian order was going to be reconstructed after 1945, but they never, of course, got that chance to do so. And in fact, of course, the Cold War was driven by the fact that, in a historical irony compared to the war, Japan had become a Cold War ally of the United States and China an opponent. This meant that the Diaoyu-Senkaku Island dispute lay dormant for some decades, but by the early 2010s, tension began to rise over those small islands in the East China Sea. And the Chinese interpretation showed the very fluid nature of the way in which they used that World War II legacy to press claims. The first part of the Cairo Declaration, which I just read out to you, is interesting because it does not name the Diaoyu Islands specifically. It does name certain things explicitly, but not those islands. And since they were designated as Japanese actually in 1895 as part of the first Sino-Japanese War, they don't technically fall under the since 1914 clause. Nor, of course, are the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China the same thing, which is one reason that Taiwan also claims those islands. Yet nonetheless, in 2013, on the 70th anniversary of the conference, the Chinese news media reported extensively that the Cairo Declaration gave the authority of international law to Chinese claims over the Diaoyu-Senkaku Islands. And the Global Times, which many of you will know, is, like Fox News, a fair and balanced view of domestic and international politics, stated, on the eve of the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Cairo Declaration, which stated that all territories Japan had stolen from the Chinese should be restored to China, experts at home and abroad called on the international community to jointly safeguard the established international order. And this argument that essentially Cairo meant that this particular historical and territorial claim should be maintained became a very, very strong part of the discourse of that year, even though there was a remarkable sleight of hand going on, historically speaking, in that it essentially applied that there was a very clear linear historical line from this set of events 70 years before to Chinese claims by Beijing in 2013, as if a few small things such as the Communist Revolution, the Civil War, and so forth had never actually happened in between. The way I sometimes like to think of it was that essentially they were arguing that Chiang Kai-shek had written a check during the Second World War, which the CCP was now ready to cash. I realise that the younger generation here, I'll have to explain it later what a check is, but along with other ancient technology like DVDs and so forth. Not everyone, even in China, took this claim entirely seriously. And one of the things that I want to point out is that this discourse is not just about a top-down propaganda ministry pushing forward with heavy-handed historical interpretations. There's plenty of that. But China being a lively place, I always like to think of, say, China as a plural noun. Very soon there was a response to this particular set of ideas about the war. One way in which the propaganda ministry did decide that they were going to drive home their claims coming from the Cairo Declaration was that obvious follow-up to make a blockbuster movie. And in fact, has anyone here seen Cairo, the 2015 film? Already heard of it? Okay, well it's another blast. Basically, it's a 2-hour blockbuster movie about the gathering and signing of the Cairo Declaration of November 1943. And that doesn't have you rushing to Netflix. I don't know what will. But this then caught the attention of China's internet population when a poster, an internet poster for this movie, which is a very solemn historical epic, started going out on the Chinese net in 2015. Because in a sort of act of not exactly being more Catholic than the Pope, but rather more kind of red than the Chinese Communist Party, a film poster, basically putting forward all these major characters, with the actors playing them, was put out on the internet, and there was someone playing Roosevelt, someone playing Churchill. But mysteriously, the character not of Chiang Kai-shek, but Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong, appeared on this poster, which was news to anyone who knew that, of course, Mao was safely in his caves in Yan'an in northwest China at that time, and neither at that or any other point of his life ever got closer to Egypt than probably Moscow, I would have thought. And the Chinese internet, bless their hearts, immediately started coming back with a whole variety of alternative, altered posters. Here are some of, so that's the original poster for Cairo Declaration, which has people, there's the Chairman Mao character, as you see, various the characters, Stalin, that's the evil Japanese, I think it's General Okamura. And here, that's Winston Churchill, who, by the way, is played by an American in this movie, which may or may not be a tribute to his American mother, Jenny Jerome, or it may just be bad casting. But no sign of Chiang Kai-shek, only Chairman Mao. So the netizens got together to produce some alternative versions of this poster, which look like this. I particularly like Barack Obama as Mao. I think that is a particularly good one, or Young Kim. There are alternative versions. You can find your own. There's a version with Yao Ming, the basketball player. There's a version with Saddam Hussein. There is a version with Gollum from Lord of the Rings. So eventually, in embarrassment, the producers of the movie had to withdraw it and basically, redo it with. Chiang Kai-shek does actually appear in the movie as a character, I should say. But it's also a sign that sometimes being too ideologically determined in this sense is something that the wider Chinese reading and thinking public, who are by no means stupid, don't entirely buy wholesale. The content of the film, again, which I won't discuss in huge data for reasons of time, but is available, actually quite easily with subtitles as well, and well worth watching, is very interesting for how it codes a whole variety of issues that are important in terms of China's self-presentation in the wider world, and also making references to this World War II past. So, you think you're watching a movie, but in fact it's an international relations seminar. At one point, the actor playing FDR declares, quotes, "War has changed China. China's war has changed the world. China is a responsible world power," which I'm not sure is a direct quote from FDR. It's just not any biography of him I've ever found. But of course, the first 2 points are exactly the points that Xi Jinping was making and that Hu Qiaomu had been making earlier. The idea that the Second World War and China's participation in it both transformed China itself and changed the nature of international order by giving China standing within it. And off the back of that, that phrase, China as a responsible world power, exactly echoes the idea of 中国是一个负责任的大国, the idea of China being a responsible world power as a phrasing for its peaceful rise, which was very much a key phrase, and then peaceful development as the follow-up term in the 2000s and 2010s. I'm conscious of time, so I want to just give a, how long have I got for it? About 5 minutes, 10? Five is good. Yes. Okay, in that case, I just use the 5 to show 2 other quick examples of other areas in public culture where I think the domestic, the international, and the war come together. So you have more time, you can have more movies, but now you're going to miss out. One obvious one was the Victory Parade, 3rd of September 2015, which was remarkable in many ways. One was that it was really the first time that an all-out, full-scale parade with, thousands and thousands of troops making their way through Tiananmen Square was held to commemorate an event that was not directly connected to the history specifically of the Chinese Communist Party. So the one that was held 3 weeks ago, which you probably saw on TV or elsewhere, was of course very much commemorating the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. Most of the other such parades were along those lines. This was the first time that in fact it was the Second World War that was being pulled out as a point of reference, which was being shown in the most blatant and obvious way possible to a national television audience. And that audience was both domestic and international. Domestically, one of the, in my opinion, actually very moving moments that happened in the middle, which was not much noticed, was the parading of 8 veterans, aged between I think about 90 and 102 of the Second World War, 4 of whom were communists and 4 of whom were Kuomintang nationalists. And being paraded in front of Xi Jinping on national TV, literally and symbolically at the heart of China, was an important gesture of reconciliation in a fissure which still, because of the civil war between the two, ran very deep in many communities. But it was the international guest list that also provided a lot of very interesting clues, both who was not there and who was. Shinzo Abe was invited, but didn't go. Kim Jong-un apparently didn't get invited at all, whereas to make it even worse, then South Korean President Park Geun-hye was indeed invited and was very prominent in the parade alongside then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, so South Korea 2, North Korea 0. Now, of course, Kim Jong-un is in Beijing all the time and Park Geun-hye is in jail, but that's showbiz. Also present, of course, was Vladimir Putin, flagging up current alliance, the China-Russia alliance, which of course is becoming, or at least relationship, which is becoming much stronger, but also, of course, creating a historical sleight of hand, since, as we've mentioned, the Soviet presence in the China war was actually very marginal until the last days of the war. And also, there was a significant amount of military presence from countries which had not had a huge involvement with the Second World War, which was central to the Belt and Road Initiative, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan amongst them, as well as ASEAN countries like Laos and Cambodia, and of course Pakistan and Afghanistan, which did not in themselves take part in World War II, but none from India, which of course did, although of course you count Pakistan as being part of British India at that time. In other words, an occasion celebrating the Second World War was being used also to flag up new alliances while bolstering myths about the old ones. And in particular, it was possible to see the shape of the Belt and Road Initiative emerge within the countries that were placed on parade in Beijing. And one last example, probably one of the more famous ones, of a wartime-related aftermath, which is the eternally controversial subject of the South China Sea. And while the intricacies and disputes of who really deserves to be in charge of the South China Sea and who actually is in charge of the South China Sea is not something, particularly in 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to elaborate on at any great length. But I do think it's worth pointing out more explicitly than sometimes has been done, that one of the major reasons that we're in the situation that we are now with the South China Sea dispute is because of the nature of the post-World War II settlement. The first appearance of this, the originally 11-dash line, which was written by Chinese map makers at the end of the Second World War, was the point of origin that's then been drawn on and used by the People's Republic of China to make their own maritime claims in the region, at least one section of them. But of course, it's worth remembering the Cold War context. At that time, the expectation was still that a post-war nationalist China would be US-oriented, and therefore a claim of this sort towards the South China Sea would have actually been in service of US control of the Pacific rather than in opposition to it. As it turned out, it was something of a hostage to fortune, and it's been written about in detail by many distinguished historians of China, including Chen Tianping of Nanjing University, who's an old friend of mine, who draws on a variety of very convincing primary documents, but makes a pretty uncompromising case that this shows, definitively as he would argue, that the Chinese case in the South China Sea is made. And a quote from his article: after World War II, the Republic of China, as one of the big four, Soviets, British, Americans, and Chinese, took back the sovereignty of the islands in the South China Sea in accordance with the international law and the new international order in the Asia-Pacific region laid down by the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Declaration. And by renaming the islands and using its naval project, the Chinese government, meaning the nationalist government in 1947, declared its sovereignty to the world. So in that case, an absolutely explicit statement that there is a line of continuity and a line of legitimacy that runs from claims made in the late 1940s as a deserved reward for China's contribution to winning the Second World War, to the point today where the reconstructing order in Asia draws on those claims that were laid down much earlier on. So let me conclude, if I may, with a last set of thoughts about why this remains not the only element by any means, but one important thread in terms of China's construction of its own sense of national identity and its projection of that identity in the wider world. China's international relations draw on history, I think, because they are beset by a continuing inability, but huge desire, to create a narrative with significant contemporary moral weight behind it. And the one thing, of course, they can't use is what the United States was able to do from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, which is to argue that their point of origin may have been in World War II, but the reason that the United States has remained in the region is because of democratization and the choice by freely voting publics in the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, to maintain those relationships with the US, and China is clearly not in a position to be able to do that. They have had some attempt to seek that moral basis from an emerging discourse about the value of Chinese economic development, and if you hear, as I have and many people have, also presentations about BRI, about the Belt and Road Initiative, then the benefits of economic growth and human development that come from that project are very much made central to the Chinese case. Yet China's quest for a raised moral status, but the associated idea of China sharing in the moral agenda of the war effort has, I think, been quite difficult to animate. The economic argument is cautiously welcomed by some in the region, to cite the dangers of debt diplomacy and so forth. But I think that China is still a long way from being able to create the idea internationally that the Chinese system is virtuous in its own right and draws its legitimacy from that presence in the anti-fascist wars of the 1940s. In the Cold War, both the American and Soviet systems generated their own moral discourses, often based on similar sounding vocabulary of peace and democracy, but consisting of contrasting worldviews. The legacy of the Second World War was drawn into service to argue for either superiority of liberal capitalism or of socialism. But with the war more than 7 decades in the past, and with little sense yet of China being able fully to integrate and bring about that mixed set of narratives that can generate, and I've saved it to the very last sentence to use the fatal term that we all know, soft power, in that strict Zhou Enlai sense of being able to influence without coercion. I think that Beijing's discourse about the war still has a long way to go. Nonetheless, it is real, it is invested in, it exists in popular culture, in educational culture, and in the wider culture in China in all sorts of ways that are not always immediately visible and legible from the outside world. But that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. And I think to understand that wider development of China's nationalist presence in international society, we need to understand that memory of the wartime period really matters, and matters perhaps more in the 21st century, even than it did in the late 20th. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. I think we have about 10 more minutes for questions. I'm going to take advantage of my position here. You make a very convincing case about the importance of memory, and I keep thinking, what is the source? What is the agent for any of this? One can think of something narrowly as propaganda, one can think of something as broad as a sensibility or as a zeitgeist. And I guess the reason why that question would matter is I kept thinking throughout how much of this is party history and how much of it is national history, and how much is the party using it for one way or another. So you can sort of help us think about that. The second question I had was, do I understand you correctly? If your interpretation is that China sees the old order as legitimate but not correctly interpreted, as opposed to the current order being illegitimate and need to be replaced, which strikes me as a really interesting argument and have pretty profound policy implications. So I would love to hear more about this.
And I'll leap up again if I may, just so everyone can hear. Thank you, Frank, for two great questions. I think that there is a very significant difference between party history and national history in this case. And I think it's much more evident if you look, as most of the chapters of the book actually do, at domestic politics and the political culture of China. Because actually, one of the chapters that I found most interesting to write, because it involved the greatest contrast, was the one about the way in which different regions of China, which is after all a very, very varied society, respond to this war history. And to put it as most simple, Chongqing and the southwest of China, and Chongqing served as the wartime capital of China during those years, has actually pretty much reclaimed that history and made it a kind of heroic story of how that particular nationalist government stood up against the invaders, with very little mention of the Communist Party at all. Now, clearly this is not a discourse that Beijing would want from first principles to have propagated if it had a choice. On the other hand, it understands enough about the importance of regional identity, of making sure that regions kind of reasonably consensually existing within the PRC structure, which actually in some ways is much more about bandwagoning and people kind of finding consensual agendas than it is sometimes realised. And to that extent, essentially an awful lot of history, which when you read it looks pretty confrontational towards the official top-down Beijing narrative, can be found. The reason that I think the international discourse, which I concentrated a bit more in this talk, is so much thinner compared with that, is that within China itself, there is a historical background and a richness and an ecology within which those things can be discussed, whether explicitly or implicitly. You know, people operating on social media, discussing aspects of history, or watching movies, or reading non-fiction, or whatever else it might be. The ability to convert international society, A, is held back partly because of the constraints in China's own self-presentation, the inability to make essentially developmental welfarist authoritarianism, which is what the Chinese system is at the moment, internationally attractive in and of itself, combined with the fact that that story about China's wartime experience needs so much background to start from and so many premises to be overturned that it's really quite hard to do this late in the game. So I think that's why I think this discourse is very rich at the domestic level, but actually in some ways quite thin at the international level. And in terms of your second point, you have it exactly right. I think that to some extent the argument about whether China is a revisionist power, international order, can turn into a slightly sterile one, which assumes a sort of it's either a revisionist power or it's a status quo power. And actually there are clearly elements. I mean, I think at the moment the question of whether the United States is a revisionist power or a status quo power is quite an important one. But I think that particular element you mentioned, the understanding that a large part of the discourse is not about delegitimizing current order, and famously, Xi Jinping's speech at Davos in January 2018, which 2017, without ever explicitly using the words President Trump, nonetheless talked about China as a defender of the World Trade Organization, about climate change agreements, and all of these aspects of that order, as well as a kind of wider implication that the whole of the post-45 order was at least something that needed guardians. That is something that I think that many Chinese historians, policymakers, politicians would very much say was part of their agenda, but they wish the Chinese presence at the creation to be part of that understanding more broadly, and feel at the moment, for all sorts of reasons, that it is not.
Why don't we collect a few, and then you can answer them when you sort of find the authors. Tell Professor Miller who you are.
So, Professor Miller, my name is Mario Colella. I studied previously at the Nanjing Center that we have at the sites. And one thing that I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you have your recent book translated into Chinese.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about the exchanges within the Chinese scholastic world, within the wider world of Chinese history internationally?
Absolutely. Okay.
In the back.
I'm Yasmin. I'm a research fellow at the Reichsschauer Center here at SAIS. I think I wanted to push back a little bit with
Please do.
Chinese nationalism and collective memory, does the history really begin with World War II? Or does it stretch back even before that, when the last time Asia inhabited sort of a Sino-centric order and China practiced the Huayi system? Basically, the Han Chinese are the beacon of civility and in an otherwise barbaric world, and they very much relied on a discourse of ethnicity to kind of justify its civilizing mission. Do you see what are do we lose anything intellectually when we begin our history with World War II? And do we see that kind of ethnic-based justification for world order coming back in China, in Chinese presence in contemporary global
Great.
order?
Why don't we add one more? Sure. Chance. Let's see another hand.
My name is Evan Sankey. I wonder if the story that you're telling about the rehabilitation of China's role in World War II, if it also maps onto the U.S.-Japan alliance. Japanese views of the U.S.-Japan alliance. It used to be, when after normalization, U.S.-Japan alliance was viewed positively, maybe in part because it sort of kept Japan down. And today, I think it's viewed a lot less positively. And I wonder if your argument maps onto that.
Shall I?
I would take those three and then any final
Yep,
thoughts.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the three excellent questions. In terms of engagement with scholarship, I actually gave a paper yesterday at the history department over at Homely Campus, which is a chapter of the book which deals very explicitly with the politics of historiography. One of the things I really touched on almost not at all, I've been mentioning one scholar at Nanda in this paper, but actually is very, very visible and very legible through the sources, is the way in which, when it was decided by people like Wu Jianmu that actually it was time to start rehabilitating the hidden and forgotten parts of the wartime history within China, including parts particularly relating to the Kuomintang, that the people tasked with doing this, who had their own autonomous research agendas as well, were professional Chinese historians, particularly at places like Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Nanjing University, which of course you know personally from being there, and Nanda is very much one of the centres of research in this particular area. Fudan would be another place actually which was very much part of that agenda as well. And one of the things that's fascinating to see is the way in which there is a sort of engagement between different agendas. Chinese historians, many of whom are very distinguished and very expert, coming out of the Cultural Revolution, which was still very much within living memory in the 1980s, of course, feeling that it was finally time that they were actually going to be allowed to do some real history. And at the same time, the state saying, well, actually, we want you to do this history because we want to open up these areas that were closed down before it. But we also have our own agendas, which have to do with how we're going to approach Taiwan and how we want to kind of portray the idea of China as being a heroic society that fought back against the invaders. So these are not tracks that go in divergent directions, but they're ones that sort of meet and then diverge and come back together again at various points during that development. And having talked, as I did, sort of off-the-record interviews with a variety of historians who lived through that period, they were quite happy on an anonymous basis to say that there was very explicit political pressure from a whole variety of areas over the decades to read the material in this way, or to publish this, or not to publish the other. And quite often they would find themselves having to decide where they wanted to push back and where they would have to accommodate that. That leads, if I may, to an answer to the second question, or set of questions from the lady at the end there. Thank you for those. I do think that the discourse around World War II specifically is special for a couple of reasons. I agree it's not the only historical discourse. I'll address the second point in a second. But to explain why I think that this one is important. The Second World War does a variety of things in the construction of Chinese ideas of a contemporary national identity that other historical events can't do. So the Opium War is also part of that idea of a wider century of national humiliation. But China lost the Opium Wars badly. And so as an example of how China is treated badly by the outside world, it's a great example. As an example of China being a kind of heroic nation that kind of fights back, it's not great. World War II, China may have staggered to the end, but it won. It was on the winning side, and therefore you'll find Xi Jinping, amongst others, talking about the Second World War explicitly as the first war that China managed to win on its own as a nation. I mean, on its own, I think is a bit of a stretch, but you know, it definitely creates the idea of victim moving to a state and society with agency in its own right, and that's a very different sort of discourse. And the problem is that nothing after that works either, because you can't redo that the Great Leap Forward, you can't do it with the Cultural Revolution, you can't do it with the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, and you can't do it with Tiananmen Square 1989. So actually the Second World War ends up as being one of the few things within relatively living memory that has that kind of valency. The other reason, and I alluded to this, but just to say it again, is that the Second World War is one of the very, very few historical events that works for the rest of the world. Everyone, not everyone, but most of Eurasia and North America has its own World War II story even now. Our country is going through a little thing called Brexit. One of the many, to me, appalling things about Brexit is the way that various people keep saying about how Britain got through the Second World War and this is basically the Second World War again. It's not. Anyone who's been to a real war would know that this is rubbish. You know, France is still consumed by all sorts of debates about the legacy of collaboration, whatever it might be. And in that sense, China inserting itself into what, for good or ill, has become one of the great moral narratives of international society of the 20th and the 21st century, has an awful lot of power and valency that these other events can't have. But very final brief answer to your last question. In terms of ethnic difference, I don't know. I think it seems to me more that the Chinese state is dancing this very difficult line in which it finds it very difficult to acknowledge ethnic difference within China, which is of course leading to problems in Xinjiang and all sorts of other places, because it wants to argue almost in a French kind of a way that everyone Chinese is a Chinese citizen and there is no kind of racial and no ethnic difference. That's led to all sorts of problems in France, I have to say, and in a very different sort of society in China, I think it's also leading to a problem because it has a whole variety of issues of denial under it, which actually might be better acknowledged in terms of a more frank discussion of ethnicity. But that might be an argument for more discussion about ethnicity rather than less. And the final point about the US-Japan alliance, very, very sharp point, and absolutely right. One of the reasons that I brought that 1987 point up is that I do think more and more that mid-1980s moment in the history of China is very anomalous and very interesting because it's one where essentially the US presence in East Asia is still regarded as better being there than not least because as late as 1987-88, the Chinese leadership was still very wary about the Soviet Union, didn't know what to make about Gorbachev. There's still plenty of living memory of 1969 when the two countries nearly went to war. So in that sense, yes, I think that is a significant shift in the present day, where clearly one of the things that China would love to do would be to bust up the US-Japan alliance, which is one of the reasons why, of course, as I'm sure you've seen in the last year or so, Beijing has been extremely friendly to the new emperor, to Shinzo Abe, and to Japan as a whole, and I think is hoping to try and get a fair bout of diplomatic advantage at a time when perhaps the US-Japan alliance is not in the most healthy state that it's been since it was originally established.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking